Welcome to Dialogue, sir.
Thank you, Ray. My pleasure.
It seems there is a mixed feeling, a mixed response from the international society as to the leadership of China for developing countries. In a sense, China, not only because of its dynamic economic expansion the world over, but our mode of development might be given a second thought for those who are going through the transition politically and economically. However, those in the West are very skeptical because they say, hey, this is a communist regime, quote unquote. Therefore, it cannot set a good example for the rest of the world. Now, I'd like to have your comments on the eve of the Forum of China-Africa Cooperation in Johannesburg.
Well, Ray, that's a very interesting perspective. Let me say a mixed response is coming from the West, not from the South. I think from the South, China is seen as an inspiration. The remarkable rate of development and pace of development that China has undergone in the past 3 decades has been an example that many of us look up to. It doesn't matter what system of governance you have in place. What is more critical is how you utilize your systems of governance to enhance the life of your people, to enhance development, and to lift the country as a whole. And that's the example China has for the rest of the world. Of course, the West has always stood out as the perfect example of what we need to follow, those of us that are developing. And we have seen what has happened in the past 5 or 6 years, since 2008, the financial crisis, both in Europe, in the Americas, the major challenges they are facing in terms of, if they had the perfect system of governance, you wouldn't have had these fault lines emerge. So one cannot say they have the perfect system and the system that China has is not. So ultimately, as I say, the measure of success must be based on what you do in terms of lifting the country and the living standards of your people.
But I'm afraid you have to give a second thought as to the alleged source of inspiration coming from an Oriental country like China, because you are a democracy since 1995, and you have a powerful trade union, and you have a coalition government, which itself is very different in a very unique way from what we have institutionally in China. Therefore, how to balance prosperity with democracy or democratic expression has been a chronic concern for not only those who follow the political process in your country, but also for people like you in South Africa, to be very careful about whether the Chinese experience would be applicable for developing countries.
Well, of course, South Africa and China have 2 different systems of governance. Yours is socialist based, which in my estimation has elements of democratic principles, whereas South Africa is a democratic dispensation. But ultimately, as I've mentioned earlier on, what we borrow from China is not your system of governance. We have a system of governance that we chose at the dawn of democracy, and that is the democratic dispensation that we have. The coalition is with the ruling partners and its 2 alliance partners, the Communist Party and COSATU, the largest trade federation. That's the coalition. Again, what we borrow from China is your developmental model. That is what we seek to borrow.
But Anil, in the primary stage of China's development, we did so much to harm the environment. And that is fast becoming a major concern for the formidable Chinese presence and investment in Africa. You have very strong media voices, you have a very noisy opposition forces. Forgive me for using noisy, because we don't have that kind of opposition voices in our parliament, which is itself is not called parliament, but People's National Congress. And therefore, the environmental protection would often come across as an issue that prevents the Chinese investment, and that would take a long time for negotiations, business negotiations. That will seriously undermine the efficiency of whatever investment What do you think of the concerns of those who oppose the Chinese investment?
Well, look, China is not unique. If you look at the success of the USA in terms of its economic growth, development to becoming an economic superpower, the Industrial Revolution in Europe, which enabled the major European powers to become major powers, be it the UK or France, they all depended on energy systems that was on what we call dirty fuels or fossil fuels. Their development was generated by coal in the first instance. The European Union started as a coal union, coal miners' union. That was the incubation of what ultimately turned out to be the European Union. So China followed the same route, naturally. So the criticism that comes today is that China, you have, through your rapid development, not taken environmental issues into account. Now, of course, we live in a totally different age today where the environment is foremost of concern to humanity as a whole. And we draw lessons. We draw lessons from the mistakes that Europe made, the mistakes that USA made, and the mistake that China made and which China is aware of. Therefore, President Xi has put a very ambitious plan forward. Even now, as they prepare to go to COP21, China has made some major announcements in terms of reducing your emissions. So I think we draw lessons from the mistakes made by others, and to ensure that we don't make similar mistakes, and that we develop policies in terms of ensuring that we have a large percentage of renewables, of green energy as part of our mix. But speaking for South Africa itself, we are still quite dependent on fossil fuels, naturally so, because we are a coal-rich country.
I was told that the issue of a reindustrialization tops the agenda of the new South African government. With so many young people, up to 60% of them being jobless.
Yes.
They don't have any jobs.
Of our youth, yes.
Exactly. So what can you do to guarantee the job opportunities? Without jobs, young people could generate more crimes. That's one of the major concerns for the Chinese tourists who would give a second thought before they make their way to South Africa.
Well, South Africa is acutely aware of the challenges we face, and one must see it in its fuller context, that the challenges we have today, youth unemployment, large rate of unemployment, 25% of the formal sector unemployed, which we don't try to hide. It's a challenge that emanates from our historical past. And the fact that the majority community of the youth today are disadvantaged is because of the denial to good education, to good training from the previous regime. So this is something that we have been grappling with over the past 20 years, and therefore we have put in place certain measures. Firstly, our industrialization base was eroded, and South Africa grew at a reasonably good pace post-94, and prior to the economic crisis of 2008, the financial crisis that affected the global community, including South Africa, we were on target to grow at 6% by 2010. We had reached 5.8% in 2007. And we had said that we have to reach at least 6% of growth to start eroding in terms of unemployment and creating jobs. But secondly, a major part of the growth was generated by the services sector. Some 69% of South Africa's economy is in the services sector. And as you're fully aware, the services sector is not an employer of huge numbers. So therefore, the focus now to our reindustrialization process. And a number of policy documents have been put on the table to get to that point of reindustrialization of South Africa. The Industrial Policy Action Plan, our new growth path, the National Development Plan, which has a vision of where we'd like to see South Africa by 2030. All of these documents have been put on the table over the past 5 or 6 years since the administration of President Zuma took office in 2009. And this is an ambitious plan which we are already implementing, and China is an important partner for us in this process.
Before addressing what China can do to help with the process of reindustrialization in your country, I'd like to ask you about what has happened since you adopted the idea of a Southern African Development Community in the early 1980s. Are you going to keep your borders open? Because recently there was a massive xenophobic rioting in your country upon the request of a KwaZulu chief, and many Africans complain that they have been deprived of jobs by illegal immigrants. And after the unrest, your government decided to tighten the visa policy that has seriously affected the commerce activities, normal commerce activities, including those from China. In this way, how can you balance the issue of illegal immigration and economic dynamics in, for example, facilitating the regional integration process within the framework of a Southern African Development Community? Regional integration is, of course, an inevitable process in a large sense.
Well, firstly, I think it's important to historically recognize the role played by SADC, the Southern African Development Community. A number of the SADC states were referred to as frontline states who were at the forefront in campaigning for a free democratic South Africa. So SADC was a very important body, like the Organization of African Union, our continental body, until we changed the name in 2002 to the African Union. These two bodies were at the forefront in campaigning for a democratic South Africa. So when South Africa became a democracy in 1994, we were reinstated in terms of our membership of SADC and in the OAU at that stage. So I think one has to see the important role that they played in us achieving liberation and made many, many sacrifices, especially a number of SADC countries, our immediate neighbors.
But I'm afraid you are not ready yet to have the free movement of human resources across the traditional borders.
Well, look, we are moving. We adopted in 2008 the SADC free trade area. We created that. We are moving towards regional integration in all of our regional economic communities. That is an African Union agenda, integration of the continent, because one of the impediments to continental growth and prosperity is that we are not integrated enough. For example, inter-African trade is at about 13%, unlike Europe where it's at about 65% or ASEAN over 50%. Now,
yes, you are proud of those official statistics and figures, but given the current chaos regarding the problems in the European Union, which might serve as a role model for East Asia and for the South African Development Community, are you going to adopt the single currency Schengen agreement? Because that's a big problem for those politicians in Eastern and Central European countries in the context of refugee crisis. Therefore, free movement of labor might be a problem, more problem than a solution.
well, one of the challenges that the European Union is facing today is that integration took place at a rate that they were not ready for. It went very fast, from 10 members to 15 to 25 to the current 28. The African Union has adopted a more incremental approach, and therefore we are looking at setting goals for ourselves that we have everyone on board, because you must understand also the levels of development in Africa varies vastly, from South Africa and Nigeria to some of our LDC countries. There's a vast gap. There's a vast gap. So it's important, if one looks at just the SADC region, that South Africa cannot prosper by itself while our neighbors faces poverty, underdevelopment, unemployment. In order to address the very problems that you alluded to in terms of mass movement of people into South Africa, that is partly because there is not enough opportunities in those countries. So we have to ensure that as we lift South Africa in terms of our level of development, the same happens with our neighbors, so that you have equitable development in the region, which prevents this kind of pull that you experience